Welcome back. In this video, I want to give you a gentle introduction to something called path analysis. And I'm saying a gentle introduction because this is a fairly advanced topic, and I just want to give you an overview of what path analysis involves and what it's good for and what it can accomplish. And I also want to give you a basic level introduction to two types of path analysis without going into too much detail about the statistical calculations or procedures involved. So let's start with the definition of path analysis. It's a method for testing possible cause and effect sequences using correlational data. So path analysis is a type of non-experimental research. In a path analysis, you don't do any random assignment to conditions, and you don't do any manipulating of situations. In a path analysis, you gather data the same way you would in a correlational study. In a path analysis, you simply gather data from people without doing any manipulation. And what that typically means is you gather data using self-report questionnaires. And just like a correlational study, a path analysis has low internal validity. In a path analysis, you can't confidently say that A leads to B. You can't confidently say that a certain cause and effect possibility is the truth. But what a path analysis does allow you to do is test a set of possible cause and effect sequences and decide which of those possibilities is the most consistent with the data. So in a path analysis, you can't confidently say that a certain cause and effect sequence is the truth, but what you can say is, out of all of the cause and effect sequences that I tested, I'm the most confident about this one, because this one is the most consistent with the data that I gathered. So now let's go into the two types of path analysis that I want to cover. The two types of path analysis that I want to cover are called mediation analysis and the cross-ligand panel design. I'm going to go over these one at a time, and for each one, I'm going to go over the purpose of the method. I'm going to go over how data is collected. I'm going to go over how data is analyzed, and I'm also going to go over the possible outcomes of the method. So let's start with mediation analysis. So mediation analysis is used to test whether a third variable mediates the relationship between two other variables. So before you can understand this statement, you have to understand what the word mediation or mediator means. So a mediator is an intermediate step in a cause and effect sequence. Basically, if A leads to B and B leads to C, B is the mediator in that cause and effect sequence. It might help if I give an everyday life example of mediation. So imagine you're at home and you want to get a glass of water from the tap. So you go up to the sink, you turn on the faucet, and then you pour and then the water comes down into your cup. When you're doing that, you turning on the faucet causes the water to come out, and the water coming out causes the glass to fill up. So if you think about that sequence of turning on the faucet and the water coming out and the water filling up the cup, the water coming out is the mediator of that sequence because turning on the faucet causes the water to come out, and the water coming out is what causes the glass to fill up. So the water coming out is the intermediate step. So basically, the water coming out is what allows the first step to lead to the third step, basically. So that's an example of mediation in everyday life. So in a mediation analysis, a researcher has a hypothesis that a certain variable is a mediator or an intermediate step in a certain cause and effect sequence. And the researcher gathers data and tests whether the data is consistent with that variable being a mediator. And the way data is collected is three variables need to be measured, and one of those three variables is going to be tested as the mediator. So imagine that a researcher has a hypothesis that income leads to less financial stress, and less financial stress leads to more happiness. If that's the researcher's hypothesis, then the researcher is hypothesizing that lower financial stress is a mediator between income and happiness. And the researcher would do the mediation analysis, and the researcher would decide if the data is consistent with that possibility. And the way data is analyzed in a mediation analysis is the researcher carries out a series of regression analyses, which is actually outside of the scope of our class, which is why I'm not going to go into too much detail about regression. But Regression is related to the calculation of correlation coefficients. Actually, the line that you see in a scatter plot is called the regression line. And when you do a regression analysis, you're testing the slope of that line, and you're testing if the slope is significantly different from zero. But I'm not going to go into too much detail about that because that's outside of the scope of our class, like I said. Now let's go over the possible outcomes of a mediation analysis. Before we go over the possible outcomes, I need to explain the two paths that are being tested in a mediation analysis. The two paths that are being tested are called the direct path and the indirect path. The direct path leads from A directly to C, and the indirect path leads from A to B and from B to C. In other words, the direct path doesn't include B as a mediator, it skips over it, and the indirect path does include B as a mediator. Let's go back to that example in which a researcher has a hypothesis that income leads to lower financial stress, and lower financial stress then leads to happiness. In that researcher's study, the researcher would be testing two separate paths, and those two paths would be a direct path leading from income straight to happiness, and also an indirect path leading from income to lower financial stress, and from lower financial stress to happiness. So notice how the direct path doesn't include the researcher's hypothesized mediator, it skips over it, and the indirect path does include the researcher's hypothesized mediator, which in this case is lower financial stress. If the researcher's data is consistent with the direct path only, from income straight to happiness, or if the researcher's data is consistent with neither path, then the researcher would say that his or her data is not consistent with mediation, and that would be possible outcome number one. In that case, the researcher would say that his or her data is not consistent with lower financial stress being a mediator of that sequence. Notice how in this diagram, I'm only showing the direct path from A to C, and it skips over B. And like I said, if the data is consistent with the direct path only, then the data is not consistent with mediation. And also, like I said, if the data supports neither path, then the data is also not consistent with mediation. If the data is consistent with both the direct path and the indirect path, then the researcher would say that the data is consistent with partial mediation. So let's go back to that same example. If the researcher's data is consistent with the direct path from income straight to happiness, and it's also consistent with the indirect path leading from income to lower financial stress, and from lower financial stress to happiness, then the researcher would say that his or her data is consistent with partial mediation. In other words, the researcher would say that his or her data is consistent with lower financial stress being a partial mediator. And the reason why it's called a partial mediator is because it's not necessary it's not a necessary step. In other words, if that's what the data shows, if the data shows partial mediation, then lower financial stress is not necessary for income to lead to happiness, because income can lead to happiness through the mediator of lower financial stress, or it can lead directly to happiness and skip right by the mediator. So it's basically an intermediate step, but it's not a necessary step. And that's what partial mediation means. Now, if the data is consistent with the indirect path only, and the data is not consistent with the direct path, then you would say that the data is consistent with complete mediation. So let's go back to that same example. If the researcher's data is consistent with the indirect path, which leads from income to lower financial stress, and from lower financial stress to happiness, but the data is not consistent with the direct path from income straight to happiness, then the researcher would say that the data is consistent with lower financial stress as a complete mediator, because in that case, the data is showing that financial stress appears to be a necessary step, because if lower financial stress wasn't there, then income would have no way of leading to happiness, because the indirect path is the only way for income to get to happiness, basically. So that's complete mediation. At this point, I'd like to show you a complete diagram of the example that I've been talking about. So here we have that example in which a researcher has a hypothesis that income leads to lower financial stress, and lower financial stress leads to happiness. And right here, we can see the indirect path leading from income to lower financial stress, and from lower financial stress to happiness. And we can also see the direct path leading from income straight to happiness. And like I mentioned earlier, if the data is consistent with the direct path only, or neither path, then the data is showing no mediation. And if the data is consistent with both paths, indirect and direct, then the data is showing partial mediation. And if the data is consistent with the indirect path only, then the data is showing complete mediation, because the data is suggesting that the mediator might be a necessary step to get from A to C. And I wanted to mention that each arrow is a correlation that the researcher is calculating. So right here we have the correlation between income and financial stress. Right here we have the correlation between financial stress and happiness. And right here we have the correlation between income and happiness. But I wanted to mention that this correlation between income and happiness, the direct path, is actually a special type of correlation. When the researcher calculates that correlation, the researcher actually controls for the mediator statistically. So you can think of this bottom correlation as being the correlation between income and happiness that doesn't have anything to do with financial stress. So it's basically the correlation between income and happiness independent of financial stress. That's the direct path. And I'm not going to get into the details of how the researcher controls for the mediator, because that's getting into the statistical calculations, but I just want to make you aware of that. Now let's move ahead and look at a few more visuals just to make sure we get these ideas down. So right here, if the data isn't showing a significant correlation between income and financial stress, then one link of the indirect path is broken, which means that the data isn't showing consistency with mediation. And if the data is not showing a significant correlation between financial stress and happiness, then one link of the indirect path is broken, and the data is showing no consistency with mediation. And if both links are broken, then the same thing is true. The data isn't showing any consistency with financial stress being a mediator. So if the data is showing this, or this, then there's no evidence for mediation. If the data is showing all three correlations, and all three of them are significant, then the data is consistent with partial mediation, because direct path, well, both links of the indirect path are there, and the direct path is also there, so both paths are intact. The indirect path and the direct path are both intact, basically. And finally, if the data isn't showing this correlation at the bottom, then the direct path is broken, and the data is consistent with complete mediation, because the data is showing that you can't get from income straight to happiness. You have to go through this intermediate step to get to happiness, because only the indirect path is actually intact. So now let's go over the second type of path analysis that I wanted to cover, which is called the cross-lagged panel design. We'll actually cover that in the next section of this video.